Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. We're going to begin with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot v'divrei Torah. The topic for today is, can we believe in God after the Holocaust? And I would like to try to contextualize it. Also, I know we all have the need to speak about what happened this past Shabbat in Pittsburgh. And of course, the Holocaust, it's not comparable to any other tragedy in the life of the Jewish people. But when a tragedy strikes us, we come up with a number of questions, right? Questions about God, questions about the nature of human beings, questions about morality, and questions about politics, and all kind of questions that are attached to a tragedy like this one that we just endured together. So I would like to try to talk a little bit about that as well, but I didn't want to skip the topic for today because I think it's very interesting, very important for us to discuss it, and not only about the faith, and not only about how can we or not, we will discuss that, how can we or we cannot continue believing in a God that let horrible things happen in the world. In this case, the book is about Jews and God after the Holocaust, right? But I think that we could expand the conversation a little bit and contextualize it or recontextualize it in what we have experienced this week as a community, okay? So it's interesting because we are going to read a little bit about Richard Rubinstein, who's who's a member here at Congregation Bethel. May God bless him with a long life. And I would like to also add some insights that I have after many conversations, private and publics, that I've had with him. So I would like to enrich a little bit the text and share with you some perspectives of my conversations with Richard. Okay, so let's begin with
Which one?
Richard Rubin.
No, I thought God.
our conversations with God. Well, I talk to God. I'm not sure God listens or responds always, but yeah, I want to feel that way. We'll see.
It's late again.
It's never late. It's never late to come to study to.
You just ignore them.
So Yael was saying Eli Wiesel, right? So when I mentioned, or when I said the topic that we were going to study today, Yael said Eli Wiesel, and you're right, Yael.
The book Night is
Night and day.
what it is.
Right? That's so yeah. It's all about that. It's about struggling with faith and how do we make sense of this horrible tragedy, right? Of the Holocaust today. So that's what we're going to try to understand and study today. Okay. So the first quote here, it's interesting. It says so. The first part of the chapter is anger with God after the Holocaust. Right? So many people were angry with God. Many people are still angry with God, right? About the Holocaust or about other tragedies that have happened to the Jewish people. So this is a very human response to tragedy, right? So, and it's probably the most natural response that we have. And it is anger. We are angry. We are angry with the circumstances. We are angry with the people who committed it. We are angry with ourselves that we couldn't do anything to stop it. And then we are sad, right? And that's also part of the process. So it says here, a quote from Elie Wiesel. It says, "A Jew can be Jewish with God, against God, but not without God."
Very interesting.
I'm not sure I agree, though. It's interesting, but I want to disagree with Elie Wiesel this time. And I want to say that I think it is possible to be Jewish without God. I think faith is an important and integral part of who we are as Jewish people, but it's not a necessary component to be Jew. And we know many Jewish people who are Jews and they do not believe in God.
Right.
Right? So Judaism, I didn't want to say any names. So, it's interesting to think that Judaism, it's not about beliefs. Judaism is not about believing in God or not. Judaism, well, you are Jew if you were born from a Jewish mother, and you are a Jew if you converted to Judaism, period. Those are the two ways that defines you as a Jew. And then you are autonomous to choose if you would like to follow the mitzvot or not, and you are free to choose if you are going to believe in God or not, period. And I think that doesn't transform you or bring you into a better Jew or a worse Jew. Right? It has to do with the way that you decide to live your religion and your Judaism. Or can you tell me that a Jew that believes in God is a better Jew than a Jew that does not believe in God? Or can you tell me that a Jew that follows more mitzvot is better than a Jew that follows less mitzvot?
Well, some people would say you can. Some ultra-Orthodox people would say you can, unless you follow the mitzvot in every aspect. You're not a good Jew.
Well,
Or and some will go to say so far, and I've had this said to me: you're not a Jew. Period. And you can't argue with that because they are so the people I'm talking about are so doctrinaire that they will not.
Well, that's why we are around this table here in a conservative shul, right? Trying to, but what I would say is we know many people who are very frum and very love-servant, very Jewish observant, and they are very despicable people.
Yeah,
Yes.
but they don't kill. They lie, they cheat, they steal, but they don't kill.
Really? What about Baruch Goldstein?
Yeah. Oh, he was.
He's
No.
the exception
Well,
to the rule, yes.
No, he's not the exception. There, unfortunately, there are many. There are a number of people like that. So I cannot agree with that. I cannot agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think.
And what about the people, the ultra-Orthodox in Israel who have murdered Palestinians? There are plenty who do it. I'm not saying it's the majority, but certainly I would not agree with you that they don't murder. They do murder.
Yep. So I want to disagree.
About it.
I want to disagree with this first quote because I understand the context and I understand from where Elie Wiesel is coming.
Yes.
But I don't think that that's applicable today because we are living in a different Jewish setting or a world or religion. And I think that in the context of the Holocaust could make sense, but I understand from where he's coming. He's coming from his own personal experience,
His own background.
where when he continued to believe in God despite the Holocaust and the horrors that he faced and experienced. But we that are one generation, well, some of us are one generation after that. We are. I think that it's a different mindset.
Here's my problem, and it's kind of a personal problem, but whatever. We would like to believe, or we are brought up, all of us, are brought up to believe that in essence, there is some goodness in the world. And that goodness in the world flows from God or whatever you think God is. Okay? When that covenant, I'm using that word generically, I'm not using it, is broken, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to fix it.
What covenant?
The agreement that for whatever we do and as we live our life, there is some essential goodness in the world.
Okay, so
I can't quantify that.
No.
There's something good in the
Right.
world. And when that's broken, when that understanding is broken, whether it's accurate or not,
But
I'm
what's
not.
the other side of it? You're
Exactly.
saying
There is no other side. Well, the
Yeah,
other
you're
side is
saying-
this.
it's a unilateral promise, like you're talking about. You know,
No, it's not a
it
promise.
flows one
It's
way.
not a
And
promise.
I
It's a
remember
belief.
studying with
It's a belief.
I remember studying with Shalom Rosenberg in Israel at the Hebrew University, and he wrote a book about evil in Jewish tradition and the subject of evil. So I want to follow up on Maureen's question, right? So if there is this covenant that there is intrinsic goodness in the world, so how would you define evil, or what's the source of evil?
I can't say what the source of evil is, but I would define evil as a breach of that covenant. I'll give you an example. And it doesn't necessarily require a human actor, by the way. When very bad things happen to people, I'm not talking about illness, but things that are outside of the ordinary course of living.
The Holocaust, for
The
example?
Holocaust is a good example. The death of my youngest son is an example.
There you go.
My boys, who were raised in this shul, who were raised to believe that there was some essential goodness in the world, lost all belief at all because they made the simple. And it's an argument to which I don't have an answer, never have had an answer.
Yeah.
That how could a God, how could a loving God, that's their language, but that's what they say, do this to our brother?
Okay, so it's a very sensitive topic, but I want to address it. I want to address it, and I want to say two things. The first one is why you identify God in the equation. Why do you put God there? Some philosophers or some rabbis would say, and I would say as well, God wasn't necessarily there, or God wasn't necessarily part of that. Meaning, there are other factors that were there, that were in the Holocaust, other factors that were in the loss of your child, right? That has to do with nature, has to do with destiny, and has to do with moral and ethics, and it has to do with people, in the case of the Holocaust, with people choosing to do evil rather than good, and the free will that we have as human beings. So that would be Kushner's answer. He would say, why are you identifying God as the source of it, when God is only another factor of the entire picture? In this case, nature, destiny, illness, sickness.
That's hard. I'm trying to articulate something that I really have difficulty articulating.
Of course.
If we believe in a God, big if we believe, who is the source of all in the world, and I think at base we believe that, or we've been raised to believe that, whether we do now or not is another question, then that argument falls apart.
Why?
Because that type of evil, and I'm not talking about things that would happen in the ordinary course. For example, illness. For example, just a casual, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about deliberate action. It just falls apart, it seems to me. How could God let that happen? That's the question.
It's not God, it's people.
Well, I understand that, but that's the problem. You either believe in God or you don't believe in God.
But how do you? I guess then the other question is, how do you? Under what circumstances do you expect God to intervene and prevent evil?
I don't expect. Well, that's a very good question. It's a very hard question to answer. I mean, I suppose the argument I've seen made is, in a perfect world, right, God would not permit evil to exist. The reason for evil to exist is a very difficult philosophical proposition.
Yes.
Well, it goes back to,
But-
do you
Right.
believe people are inherently good or
Or bad.
inherently bad?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. But there is a natural course of history. There is a natural course of nature. There's a natural course of everything that is flowing around us in the world, that I think after God created the world and after God created us as human beings, there is, this deliberatively assumption or this will of God of letting things run through their natural course without God intervening necessarily in the outcome of it.
That is the answer. That's the philosopher's answer.
And mine as well.
That's the philosopher's answer.
Right.
And I respect that.
But,
I don't believe in it
okay.
because I would like to believe, and I'm really, I'm not sure what the answer is.
No one around this table has a definitive answer.
That if it's just happening casually with no external driver, I can't accept the world like that.
Well, but God is the driver.
That's the problem. But if God is the driver, how could He let it happen?
Well, He, in my opinion,
could she
and
do that?
we can discuss this for hours, but in my opinion, He purposely decides not to intervene. Because for me, the question is not how could God let this happen? The question is how could God not stop this from happening? Which is a different question.
Absolutely.
Okay,
He
so
did stop,
so
he
my,
got
my
started.
my answer is God decided not to intervene because after God
Period.
created the world, after God created us, He endowed us and the world with free will.
Well, that's
But that would also then say that none of the miracles that we talk about from the Bible happened, because those miracles imply God intervenes. The parting of the Red Sea,
Yeah.
so all of that is and I'm not disagreeing with what I'm saying. I believe that. I believe that God doesn't intervene. So you have to, but there were moments in time when we as a people did believe that God intervened.
Correct.
And then we come to something as massive as the Holocaust, and you're stuck. Because if
You
you
are.
believe that God
Sure.
intervenes, how do you possibly say
Yeah.
that God
Right.
turned
So-
his face?
Following Falkenhayn, I believe that there are certain periods in history that God felt or understood, or who knows, right? We're not God.
fell asleep.
No. that God understood that he or she needed to intervene, right? That were so crucial, important moments in the life and the development of humankind that there was a need for good and for bad, right? So the destruction of the Second Temple, the Holocaust, but at the same time, the independence of the state of Israel, right? Which was clearly for me that's a modern miracle, right? A bunch of Jews, fighting against 7 nations that had all the power in the world, right? And we won. That's a miracle, right? So
Do you believe
for
that
good,
that was
for
the
good, for good.
intervention of God?
Yeah, I do.
Interesting.
But you've just destroyed, it seems to me, what we just davened. You've just destroyed the liturgy that we just went through.
Why?
Look at
What do
it.
you
Look at what it says. I mean, you're asking for a particular thing. You're offering prayers that particular things happen, not selfish prayers.
Yeah.
Prayers.
Okay, so
For
we
good-
can discuss about the nature of prayer. I don't think that my prayers would ever change God's nature or God's will. I think that prayers could change me and my strength to face challenges in life. But
different question.
yeah, it's a whole
Yeah,
different topic.
yeah.
But we could discuss this for days, right? So let's go back to the topic, and I appreciate Jim, but my answer, and it's similar to what we're going to read here this morning, and it's that for me, God gave nature and God gave human beings their own nature, if you want, or their own course of action through history and through our lives. And after creating us, God decided that that's it. Now you have free will, and now you make your choices.
And walked away from it. And what you're saying.
But
is
you're
then
saying
No,
God
I-
didn't walk away. You're saying there are
I'm-
times when God decides
Yes.
to intervene, and other times when God doesn't. So
Correct.
I think that puts you on the horns of a dilemma that Jim's raising. You know, how do you
That's
then, how do you understand a God who can, you know, make those choices, those horrible choices, you know, and allow,
Yeah, allow
You know,
horrible
many
things to.
people say that the Jewish state was created, at the time it was created because the Holocaust.
right,
So God gave hard time in order to give good time. I don't know, I'm not
Well, we
God,
have talked
but
about it. I don't think that's right, and historically it's wrong. Period. I think
No,
the Zionist
historically
movement
it's
is
right.
way before the Holocaust, and the state of Israel is a product of the Zionist movement that
That's
has
right,
nothing
but
to do
the
with the Holocaust.
Zionist movement would not pass a decision in the UN without the Holocaust.
True, maybe the Holocaust hastened a little bit, or made it more possible. But I don't think that the Holocaust is the reason for the
No,
creation
no,
of the
no.
state of
No,
Israel.
it's
And
not
that
the
historically,
reason,
that's wrong.
but it's
There are lots of
it's
people
make
who believe that.
It's make
That's wrong.
the UN vote for Israel.
Yeah.
They would not vote for it
the
if not for
partition,
the
and-
Holocaust.
right.
But
It's
it's
very simple.
that
I was
com-
in Israel at this time. I was a little kid, but I heard all the
Yeah.
adults talking.
We've come full circle, it seems to me, because now you're faced with the problem of how do you account for evil in the world? There is evil in the
There
world.
is evil in the world, for sure.
It's there. We have to deal with it, but how do you account for it under that theory? I don't know.
Considering what happened in Pittsburgh,
Good point.
considering
Good
what
point.
happened in Pittsburgh, I think there are ways to show how these people were encouraged to be radicalized. That that there was human
activity.
action that
Okay,
led
you know,
to
come
these-
on Friday. It was a human action, not human action.
Right.
That's
Well,
what-
some people would say, so from a Jewish perspective, you have the prophets who said that God, so you know this prayer that we say, Oseh Shalom Uvoreh et Hakol, right? We say it in the morning, which means Oseh Shalom, God is the creator of peace or maker of peace. Oseh et Hakol, God makes everything that we know. But the original verse says, Oseh Shalom Uvoreh et Hara. So God is the creator of evil.
Evil.
Oh.
There is
When did it
a
change?
Hebrew song.
Well, they changed it for the prayer itself. But when you understand that, you say, well, from a philosophical perspective, if God is the source also
Everything.
of everything, right? God is the source of everything. So then what philosophers would say is evil does not exist as evil itself. It's only the absence of good. So when people act with evil, it's not evil itself, it's that goodness wasn't there.
I don't see how that helps.
So,
Yeah, it doesn't
Doesn't
help
make
me
sense.
as well.
Yeah.
but there is a Hebrew song that says there is no good without bad. Because you have to compare one to other.
have good if there's no evil,
Why?
Yeah, you could. That
Why?
was Eden.
because you can.
No, I understand. Okay. But
If everybody would be good, it
I-
will
I-
create some bad. You know, if you don't have to go to work, you have everything that come to you, you become a not so good person many times.
I had a
Huh.
friend. I had a friend growing up who was in a concentration camp. I met him in 1948, and we
I was
talked.
2 years old.
And we talked about the war. He never mentioned he was in a concentration camp,
Wow.
but he was religious. And so after knowing him for 30 years, he told me some stories about what happened in a concentration camp. And he said, I had a miracle occur to me. That's what he said. I said, really? I said, what kind of miracle? He said, well, I was in the concentration camp and I was 11 years old, but I told them I was 12, and at 12 they didn't kill you.
Huh?
They put you to work in a factory. And he worked in a bullet making factory, and he had small hands, and the machine that he used required small hands. So he decided he was going to be the best in the factory, and he was very good at it. In fact, they showed him when all the German people came to inspect, see what was happening. They brought him to his machine. He said, "This Jew makes bullets faster than anybody else in the whole factory." So he got to know the commandant because he always came with the group. So one day he heard that his mother, and his brother were going to be shipped to the killing portion of the camp. And on the way back to where they stayed, he saw the commandant's car pass by, and he went over to that car, and he was about to be shot. Because you couldn't get out of line. Right. And the commandant said, "Nicht schießen, don't shoot him." And he motioned him over, and he said, "What?" And my friend spoke German. He said, "What's the problem?" He said, "I hear they're taking my mother and brother to the killing camp." He didn't call it killing camp. They had a name for it. And the commandant said, "Es wird nicht sein. It won't be." And he saved his mother, who lived to the age of 90.
Oh, wow.
And his brother is still alive and is a lawyer. Is a lawyer. And he said, "And I believe, because it happened to me." See? So there were little miracles in that devastation.
Wow. Yeah.
And I knew this man. I knew him so well that he was studying geometry. We were both studying geometry, but he didn't understand English well enough to understand the question. So I spoke Yiddish with him, and I told him what the question was, and immediately he had an answer. So he was very bright, and and at first he became an electrician because his mother said you have to have a fach, you have to have something to make a living. And then he became an electrical engineer, and then he became a pollution control expert. And then he was asked by the government of the United States to go to China to help them with their pollution problem in Western China. So, and he's still alive. He's still alive. And he didn't even know his age for sure. Actually, he was 2 years older than I was, but I thought he was my age.
Yeah.
We don't talk to lawyers when we're talking about it. So
that's a miracle, right? That's a small miracle.
I would say it is, of course.
And there is a beautiful book that it's called Miracles of the Holocaust, I think, and it tells about those kind of miracles that happened to regular, ordinary people who were, at the Holocaust.
There's always a why. Why would it happen to your friend
and not
somebody else?
Right.
Just chance.
Yeah, that's
Well,
why
then it's not an
Then it's not a
invention.
miracle.
Then it's not a miracle.
Then
There's
it's not a
chance
miracle.
It's not a miracle.
They didn't make their bullets as fast as his friend did.
Right.
Listen, we have 10 more minutes, and I really want to. But this is a very interesting discussion. And listen, this is the most difficult topic for a believer. This is the most hardest topic for someone who believes in God, and it is connected to the topic of theodicy, right? So it's about God's justice or lack of justice, and God's intervention or lack of intervention in the world. And we are constantly confronted with it. And there is not one definitive answer. There's not one. So let me show you two things. I want to show you, and let's see if you agree with what is written here. It's on page 300. Then you can take this home and take a look to the chapter, which is very interesting. We don't have time to go over other things that I wanted to show you. But I want to show you two things. First, on page 305, it says in 1979. See that?
Mm-hmm.
Debbie, would you like to read? This is a very interesting part of the chapter.
In 1979, Yafa Eliach, herself a survivor, served on the fact-finding commission for President Carter's Commission on the Holocaust, during which she and other commission members visited Auschwitz. That evening was the night of Tisha B'Av, the Jewish fast that commemorates the destruction of both temples, and commission members attended services at the ancient Rima synagogue in Krakow. One member, Miles Lerman, the sole survivor of a large family, banged on the table at the front of the synagogue and announced that he was summoning God to a din Torah, a Jewish court. Lerman then proceeded to state his grievances. God, how could you stay here when next door is Auschwitz? Where were you when all over Europe your sons and daughters were burning on altars? What did you do when my sainted father and mother marched to their deaths, when my sisters and brothers were put to the sword?
So what is this person saying here? Saying, how could you, God, allow something like this to happen? Right? And there is an amazing movie that is called God on Trial. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
It's a very hard movie, and it's exactly this setting. It's Holocaust. It's during the Holocaust, and some people are in this barrack, and they are summoning God or bringing God for trial and asking God, God, how is it possible that we are here? We're enduring this. Where are you? Right? And they present all kind of argument. It's very interesting. It's called God on Trial. Okay, so that's the question. Let's see the answer here. Go ahead.
Okay, boy, do I agree with her. Lerman
Yeah, wait.
knew that Eliach had seen her own mother murdered in front of her eyes, walked over to her and said, do you want to say a few words? She refused to speak and later confided in her diary why. I have no quarrel with God, but only with men. I too want a trial, but not at the Remus synagogue. I would put on trial each Western university and library for harboring millions of malicious words written against an ancient people, words like murderous daggers hiding beneath the cloak of science and truth. I want to bring to trial the pulpits of countless churches where hate was burning like eternal lights. I want to try the train conductors with their little red flags for conducting traffic as usual. I want to bring to trial the doctors in their white coats who killed so casually. I want to bring to trial a civilization for whom man was such a worthless being, and to bring God to trial on what charges? For giving men the ability to choose between good and evil.
So what is she saying here, right? She's saying, do not blame God. Probably God is not part of the equation. The blame has to be on us, people, right? Because after, and I would paraphrase this, right? So after God created us and God endowed us with this free will to choose between bad or good and evil, we are responsible for those actions. So again, the question is, then why didn't God stop it, right? So if it's a powerful God who could stop everything, why didn't God stop it? I think that because God don't want us to be robots, and God doesn't want us to necessarily act according to what God is planning for the world. And since God gave us the free will, it's up to us to decide how do we want to act in this world.
But I have a question. Why is it that you do believe God intervened to enable the creation of the state of Israel? What is it about that is so compelling to you?
Because I think that there were times in history when God needed or felt the need to intervene for the sake of his people. In the case of this positive outcome, right? The negative outcome, I think it's about the nature of the world, the nature of creation, and the nature of humans. Why? I don't know. And the Hasidim say, "Lu yedativ ha'itiv." If I could understand God, I would be God, and I am not.
What does Richard Rubenstein say?
Okay, let's take a look. So then that's the second part that I wanted to share.
Talking about God, yes.
It's on page 311. It's let's read both quotes. One from Martin Buber, and the second one is from.
Can one still speak to God after Auschwitz? Can one still, as an individual and as a people, enter at all into a dialogue relationship with Him? Dare we recommend to the survivors of Auschwitz, the Jobs of the gas chambers, call to Him, for He is kind, for His mercy endures forever. We learned in the crisis that we were totally and nakedly alone, that we could expect neither support nor succor from God nor from our fellow creatures. Therefore, the world will forever remain a place of pain, suffering, alienation, and ultimate defeat.
Right? So this is a very somber.
Not somber. I mean, say, why do we go on with? Why go on?
Right, right. And when you talk to Richard, you get this feeling, right? That the world isn't working as it should, necessarily, right? And his.
Okay, yeah, God's inaction during the Holocaust led Rubinstein to conclude in After Auschwitz that contrary to the Exodus story, there's no God who acts in history.
Interesting, because that's exactly the opposite of what we are trying to say here this morning, right? That God does according to my view, I think God does intervene in certain times of history. He says, no, there's no intervention, and that's why the world seems so random and sometimes so ugly and difficult.
Right. His work is among the bleakest and most disturbing Jewish books ever written. The alternative position that the Holocaust represented not God's inaction, but rather his punishing of Jewish people for their sins, was rejected by Rubinstein as repugnant.
And which, by the way, I also reject fully. I don't think that the Holocaust is a punishment for Jews not wearing tefillin or not going to shul or not eating kosher or not hanging mezuzot on their doorpost, right? That's awful. But you have to know that some Orthodox, mostly Orthodox rabbis argued that, right? And they said that the Holocaust was a punishment.
Okay.
As some Orthodox rabbis today, well, it's different, right? But they wouldn't say, for example, that the synagogue in Pittsburgh was a synagogue.
Right. Rabbi Lau.
Right, and I wrote it down. He said, it's a place with profound Jewish flavor.
Oh, great, thanks. Right.
Yeah.
That's what he refused to call it synagogue because it was a conservative place of worship. Chief rabbi. So how can you make peace with that? I mean, right? 11 people were shot and killed.
11 Jews. 11 Jews.
Yeah. Well, would he call them Jews? Back to your point. Would he?
Well, yeah, I think he would, because they were born Jews.
I don't know.
No, but I thought your point before was if you're not observing the mitzvot, then he doesn't consider you a Jew.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
So what else does Richard?
yeah, so it says here
you?
let me just read this here, 311, the bottom paragraph. It says here, with the publication of After Auschwitz, Rubinstein became identified with the mid 1960s Death of God movement. But while the movement's radical Protestant thinkers saw God's so-called death as a fortunate event that would liberate human beings from God's heavy hand, right? So this whole idea of the resurrection of God. And so that's Christian, right? The notion that God died in a positive note to resurrect and to bring salvation to the world. Rubinstein, has a bleak estimation of human nature, found it a cause for despair, right? And I have talked to Richard about it at length, and it's, well, I asked him if he changed his mind over the years, because when you read his first books, and actually the first edition of this After Auschwitz, you get the sense that he's saying that God is dead, that God died. But now, if you ask him, and you could ask him this Shabbat, if he's here...
God died or never existed?
No, God died. Existed, but died. This is the death of God.
But I don't understand, what about that shows that God did exist, but now doesn't?
Well, so what he would say is, it's not from a God's perspective, it's from a human perspective.
Right.
So what he would say is, it's not that God died
People
for
stopped
us.
Yes.
And people stop believing. And that's how he would interpret the notion or the idea of the death of God. It's not that God died,
Right.
it's the belief, and people stop believing in God. And that makes, and let me tell you, that makes a lot of sense today. Because if you go out to the street and you ask a millennial, right, he would say, well, I don't believe in God. It's not that God died, right? But he would say, I stopped believing in God because religion and God are a source of war, divisiveness, hatred, racism. And look what happened, right, a couple of days ago because of God or because of the belief in God. So you ask a young guy out of the street and he would say, I stopped believing. And I cannot go to a church, to a mosque, or to a synagogue.
So you start to say, what does Richard say now?
Exactly that. That it's not that God died, It's that the belief in God died, and human beings stopped believing in God, and that brought
Like
the
Jim's
death of
sons
God.
after the death of
When
their
so many
brother.
people, when so many people were killed during the Crusades in the Middle Ages, did Christians have a similar feeling about God?
Yeah, and Jews, after the destruction of the temple, right, which was, we don't, it's hard for us to grasp the implication of the destruction of the second temple. But I don't want to say that it was similar to the Holocaust, but it was a major tragedy in the life of the Jewish people.
Sure.
The destruction of the second
Throwing
temple
out of the country.
was horrible, was something, just a huge tragedy. And you have rabbis who responded and said, you know what, for we cannot believe in God anymore after
And that
this
it was a punishment.
destruction. It was a punishment.
Rabbi, we're all talking about this in terms of the Jewish view. What was the Christian view after the Second World War with the Holocaust?
Well, it depends. There were a lot of different trends and different
Talking about
ways
the Pope.
but well, most of them condemned the Holocaust, right? And they said that it was a horrible episode in the life of
Oh,
humanity.
They quote a Protestant thinker after who wrote Radical Theology of the Death of God. He saw God's so-called death as a fortunate event that would liberate human beings from God's heavy hand.
Yeah.
That's not, that was one Protestant thinker.
Mm-hmm.
It's one, but what
Right.
was the overall? This
Yeah,
is what you're
yeah.
asking
So,
us.
by the way, the Second Vatican Council, right, where they talk specifically about the Holocaust and other, persecutions that are unacceptable. So clearly, popes all over history, after the Holocaust, they have condemned it as a catastrophe, not only for the Jewish people, but for humankind, for the world. Yeah. Okay, listen, we could continue discussing this forever, right? But I hope you enjoyed the class. It was a little philosophical, and I appreciate our discussion this morning. And in the light of the tragedy that we just endured this past weekend, I think that there are a number of questions that we all have. And I think that the sense of community or the need of community, it's something that you can feel it. And let me tell you, on Sunday morning, a number of people showed up for morning minyan. A number of parents were here, wandering around the hallways, because I feel like people need to get together. People have this need of talking about it, as we are doing it this morning, because we need each other and we need to be together.
A classmate of mine, a college classmate of mine, who lives in the rural area of Pittsburgh, called me on Sunday or Monday, I don't remember. And he said, the most remarkable thing has happened. And I said, my God, is everybody all right? Is your family? He said, no. He said, everybody says family was, but he said, one of the Muslim clerics called and told me that we, the Muslims, will come and stand watch at your institutions as long as you need us to prevent this from happening.
Yeah.
And it was completely unfounded.
Yeah.
And they raised money.
And they
And they
raised,
raised
money. Raising
a
money.
lot. I didn't know about
They were
that.
talking about this in NPR.
Leadership talk on the radio.
Yeah.
It was very, very strong.
There is a lot of good things, coming out from this horrible tragedy. And that leads me also to believe that that's the nature of this country. I don't want to think that one crazy guy represents and defines who we are, right? I think that this country is different.
Is the
It's different from
security
that.
guard our new normal?
For a couple of weeks.
And is
We
he
have
here
a
all the
security
time
guard.
that the synagogue's open?
Wow.
He's here when they for morning minyan. He's here for the schools
I went to school.
and Shabbat.
Yeah, because those are the times that the doors open.